So today we're going to talk about what happens when an economy hits a wall. What do you do when all the normal fixes just stop working? Well, it leads to a pretty radical experiment, a last resort that was born out of total desperation. This is the story of quantitative easing and how a huge crisis in Japan completely changed how the entire world fights an economic collapse. To really get this story, you've got to go back to post-war Japan. Just try to imagine an economy that grows so fast that in a little over 30 years, it expands 9 times over. It was nothing short of an economic miracle. It made Japan the second biggest economy on the entire planet. But that miracle, it turned into a nightmare. And it created this terrifying new question for economists everywhere. What on earth do you do when you cut interest rates all the way down to zero and the economy still keeps sinking? Okay, so it all kicks off in the 1980s, which was Japan's golden era. We're talking about companies like Toyota and Nissan. They weren't just doing well, they were absolute global powerhouses, basically dominating entire industries and setting a whole new standard for the rest of the world. And you can just see how dizzying the pace was here. The boom really ignites in 1985, it hits this unbelievable peak in 89, and then, just like that, the whole thing comes crashing down by 1992. It was a spectacular rise, followed by an absolutely brutal fall. But here's the thing. All of that incredible growth, it was built on a really shaky foundation. Right underneath that shiny surface of success, a massive, super dangerous economic bubble was inflating to just epic proportions. So how in the world did this happen? Well, the Bank of Japan kept interest rates incredibly low for a really long time. This just unleashed a flood of cheap money that poured into the stock market and into real estate. And prices went insane. Real estate prices quadrupled, and other asset prices doubled in just 2 years. It was pure speculation, a feeding frenzy that created a fatal flaw right in the heart of the system. So by late 1989, a new governor, a guy named Yoshishi Mieno, takes charge of the Bank of Japan. And he had one single, crystal clear mission in mind. He was going to deliberately prick this out-of-control bubble. And he did not mess around. He ordered interest rates to be raised 5 times, one right after the other. The effect was immediate, and it was devastating. By 1992, both the stock market and property prices in Tokyo had plummeted by a staggering 60%. The bubble had officially burst. But the crash didn't just cause a recession. Oh no, it triggered something far, far worse. This was the beginning of what we now call Japan's lost decades, a period that would create a problem that nobody had ever really seen before. For the next 20 years, the once unstoppable Japanese economy just ground to a halt. Think about this. Growth averaged a mere 0.8% a year. The economic engine that had totally amazed the world had completely stalled out. You see, this wasn't some normal recession. The entire system was clogged up. Banks were stuck with billions in what they called zombie loans. They were propping up failing companies instead of just letting them go. This paralyzed the whole banking system. And by 1998, a deflationary spiral began. That's this really dangerous cycle where falling prices just kill any reason for people or businesses to spend money. Now, throughout this whole crisis, the central bank reached for its main weapon, cutting interest rates. They cut them again and again and again, desperately trying to get people borrowing and spending, until they finally hit rock bottom. And that led them to this terrifying moment of truth. They had used their number one tool until it was completely gone. They were out of ammo. So what do you do when zero just isn't enough? This economic nightmare actually has a name. It's called a liquidity trap. It's when a central bank does everything it can. It cuts interest rates all the way to zero, but it does absolutely nothing. The economy doesn't respond. Japan was well and truly trapped. With their main weapon totally useless, Japanese policymakers were completely backed into a corner. They had no choice. They had to invent something new, something radical, an experiment born out of pure desperation. And they came up with 2 totally unconventional tools that would change central banking forever. First, something called forward guidance. And second, the big one, quantitative easing. So forward guidance was basically a bold communication strategy. The Bank of Japan went out and publicly promised to keep interest rates locked at zero until the economy was actually truly on the mend. It was their way of trying to manage expectations and show everyone they were serious about recovery. But quantitative easing, or QE, now that was the real game changer. And I love this quote, it explains it perfectly. If the economy is a car stuck in the mud, cutting interest rates is like spinning the wheels, right? Just hoping you get some traction. When that fails, QE is like getting out of the car, grabbing a giant shovel, and physically pushing new money onto the tires to force the whole thing forward. So, okay, how does this actually work? Well, the central bank buys stuff like government bonds directly from commercial banks. And in return, it gives them brand new cash, basically created out of thin air. The goal is to flood the banking system with so much new money that the banks have no choice but to start lending it out and hopefully stimulate the economy. So, the big question, did this radical experiment actually work? Well, that's where the story gets really interesting, because its legacy is complicated and its impact would eventually be felt way, way beyond Japan. The truth is, back in Japan, it wasn't some magic bullet. The immediate results were pretty modest, and to this day, economists are still debating just how effective it really was at fighting off deflation and kickstarting growth in its home country. But here's the wild part. Japan's painful experience basically became the playbook for the rest of the world. When the US financial crisis hit in 2007, policymakers followed Japan's path, almost step for step. They cut rates to zero, then they used forward guidance, and when that wasn't enough, they unleashed massive rounds of their very own quantitative easing. You see, Japan's lost decades served as this incredibly harsh lesson for the entire world. Their desperate experiment fundamentally changed how we fight economic collapse. But it leaves us with this huge, critical question for the future. In a world that keeps throwing new crises at us, has this radical experiment become our one and only answer?